Okay, it looks like we are supposed to be live right now, but I'm going to just verify on all of our different platforms. If you are joining us this morning for Museums from Your Home, our live stream series that we're doing with the University of Alabama Museums, we are streaming this morning about archaeology and more specifically the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail. And we're doing that through three different platforms. We'll be live on the Office of Archaeological Research's Facebook page. We will also be live on the Moundville Archaeological Parks Facebook page. So I'm going to go and verify that on Moundville's page. And we are also going to be streaming from the UA Museum's YouTube channel. So if you prefer to watch on YouTube, I know some people do prefer to watch on YouTube, you can go to YouTube and search for UA Museums and definitely subscribe when you get there so that you never miss any of these live streams or any of the video content that we have been putting out. So it does look like we are live, so I guess we can go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's Museums from Your Home live stream presented by the University of Alabama Museums. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I am the Communications Specialist for UA Museums. And joining me for a discussion about the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail is Matt Gage, the Director of the Office of Archaeological Research. Good morning, Matt. How are you?
Good morning. How's everybody doing this morning?
Yeah, I hope everybody's having a good Wednesday. This is the middle of the week. The week is almost over, so that is good news. Well, so before we get started, while we are broadcasting both here on Facebook and the UA Museum's YouTube channel, feel free to ask us any comments in the ask us any questions in the comments section. You can do that on both platforms. We'll see all the comments gathered together. And as a reminder, this is live, so anything can happen. So just hang in there with us in case Facebook has any issues, YouTube has any issues, or we have any issues. Hopefully that won't be the case. But in case we do have some issues, be patient and we'll try to fix them as soon as we can. All right. Well, now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, Matt, where did we leave off with the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail? Because we had a part one and now we're getting into part two. So where should we hop back on the trail?
All right. So if everybody will remember, the week before last, we were talking about a number of the Mound Trail sites. And we started with Florence Mound. We went to Gulf State Park. Then we went on to the Indian Shell Mound Park, Moundville Archaeological Park, Oakville Indian Mounds, and the Bessemer site. And then last week, I know that Dr. Donna talked quite a bit about Gulf Coast archaeology and several of the sites down along the Gulf Coast, including some in Florida and then Bottle Creek in Alabama. And I believe he had a really good discussion of Bottle Creek, and that's going to be where we'll start today.
All right.
Now, just to kind of give everybody a refresher of what the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail is, this was a partnership that we set up with the University Center for Economic Development, several tribal representatives, the Alabama Historical Commission, and the Bicentennial Commission, all of whom helped us to put this all together. And what we were trying to do was kind of highlight Alabama's incredible heritage and incorporate into the bicentennial effort a little bit more information about the things that preceded the bicentennial. Alabama celebrated 200 years, but people have been here in Alabama for at least 13,500 years. So we kind of wanted to celebrate some of the really important archaeological sites that stem from quite a while ago. And we wanted to make sure that we included sites that are protected, that we could help raise awareness of, and get people out to really start to explore their heritage a little bit more in a positive way, in a way that helps us to preserve the archaeology of our state and our region, and gives them a little bit better understanding of not only the Native American cultures that built these mounds, but also the Native American cultures that still exist today. And if you have a chance, or if you've never taken the opportunity, please go to our webpage. There's links to a lot of the tribal web pages there. A lot of the removed tribes that are in Oklahoma, the various nations that are out there, have got some great information on their web pages that will give people a better understanding of who those folks are. And right here in our own state with the Porch Band of Creek Indians, they've got some fantastic information. So take advantage of all that. Look at it on our website, and then go and experience some of those tribes' information that they present on their websites. So, all right, so let's go ahead and jump on to Bottle Creek. All right, as Mark talked about last week a little bit, Bottle Creek is in the middle of the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. It's a very difficult site to get to today, and that's primarily because of the way that we think of transportation. Europeans and the majority of Americans very accustomed to jumping in their car and driving to a park and getting out and walking around, or maybe they have to hike a little ways to get to it. That's not the case with Bottle Creek. To get there, you really got to want to get there. It's 5 miles to either side of the Delta. There is no way to walk to Bottle Creek. The easiest way to get there is to take one of the tours that's provided either by the Blakely Park or by the Five Rivers, and they can send folks out or take folks out to Bottle Creek, and they have tours that will show people around the site. But it's protected. It's owned by the Alabama Historical Commission, and it's managed by the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And it is, like Mark pointed out, a very difficult place to get to. I've been there several times in various conditions, and regardless of how nice the weather is, sometimes it is not easy to get to. Again, it's in the middle of the swamp in the summertime. There are a lot of critters that you have to contend with. I have to say that snakes don't really bother me. Mosquitoes I could do without, but they're not so bad. It's the chiggers that get me every time.
Oh,
And Bottle Creek is covered in them. So I would recommend that if you take one of these tours and go out, make sure to take your bug spray with you.
yeah,
That's definitely a must.
that's a good tip.
Absolutely. Rebecca, have you ever had a chance to get down to the Mobile-Tensaw Delta?
No, I didn't. I've been down to Mobile, but never. I don't think in this area.
Okay. The Delta is a beautiful place. It's an absolutely incredible spot, and the environment is just amazing. There's so much biodiversity down there. There's so many things to see, from massive old cypress trees to absolutely incredible fishing to there's wild hogs running all through it that are invasive, but there's also an incredible number of indigenous species that are just amazing. And one of my favorite times to be down there is in the springtime when the flowers are blooming. You can walk out to several of the parks in the area and see some of this, but to get out into the middle of the Delta is really a treat. And I would recommend that folks take the opportunity to go to either Blakely or the Five Rivers facility and take the opportunity to get out into the middle of the Delta and see what it's really all about. It's beautiful. But like we said, Bottle Creek is plunked right down in the middle of what a lot of us just consider to be a big old swamp. But it's not. It's a whole series of braided channels that are associated with a number of rivers that converge right there to form the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. And you want to talk about an absolutely perfect location for people to be able to come together in a society where river travel was one of the prime means of mobility. This was the place. And the location is very significant and would have been an absolutely incredible spot to be able to see back at the time. Undoubtedly, Mound Island, where Bottle Creek is located, would have primarily been deforested as a result of all the architecture that was needed. Most of these were structures that involved wood framing. Again, if anybody remembers from our last conversation, we talked about wattle and daub architecture, where we had posts set in the ground and then branches or vines woven between the posts and then covered with daub. which is a mixture of clay and other fibrous material. We know that Bottle Creek had a lot of structures around it, so there would have been very few trees. Add to that the fires that and cooking hearths that people would have had. Again, you probably would have been able to see the mounds in the village very clearly from any of the access points around the island. And there were what we think are a series of canals that run from the natural courses of the rivers and streams that surround Bottle Creek all the way into the site. And that means that you could have just taken your canoe, and instead of having to park it on the bank and do the almost half-mile walk that we do now to get into the site, you would have been able to paddle right up to it.
Huh.
The canal systems that are along our Gulf Coast are absolutely amazing, and the engineering that went into them just highlights how well designed and well informed and incredibly intelligent these cultures were in terms of being able to engineer both sand and earthen mounds plus canal systems that we see along our Gulf Coast. So they're really amazing. And again, the University of South Alabama has been doing a good bit of work recently on the canal systems. Those canal systems were originally identified by Walter B. Jones of the University of Alabama Museums. He went down and identified the canal that USA is working on right now down across the Fort Morgan Peninsula. And that canal looks to have its origins in the woodland, so probably right around 100 BC or so, folks started to build these canal systems that tied a lot of the inland creeks and waterways together. So we think that at one point you probably could have made it all the way from Pensacola Bay to Mobile Bay without ever actually having to go out into the open ocean.
Huh.
It's pretty amazing.
That is.
And again, here at Bottle Creek, we know that we've got one likely canal that runs on the north side of the site that would have provided people the opportunity to paddle right up to the mounds. So it's really an amazing place. We know that Bottle Creek's primary occupation was during the Mississippian, so roughly AD 1250 to 1500. And we know that I think Mark talked about it a good bit last week when Bienville decided that he wanted to go out and see these mounds. He talked with some of the native folks in the area, and they said that there were still some ceremonies that were going on out there historically. They weren't sure who had originally built the mounds, but they had a pretty good idea. And we're even more certain now that these mounds were built primarily during the Mississippian period, the Mississippian stage, and that they were occupied for almost the entire duration. Which, if you think about a city being occupied for that long of a period of time, particularly a city that had very limited sanitation and utilities, that's pretty amazing. 1250 to 1500s is a 250-year long period. When we think of our older cities like Philadelphia and New York, at this point, they're at that point, and that's about how old they are. And the majority of those cities have had sewers and water systems that are taxed at this point, but they've been in place for a couple hundred years. And they didn't have that at Bottle Creek. Instead, what they had were probably seasonal inundation periods that helped to scour portions of the site and help to take care of things like cholera and other things that you can get from unsanitary conditions. Plus, again, it points to the engineering capabilities of the folks that were out there, that they knew how to handle these situations. But to have a city last that long in this type of an environment is pretty amazing. Now, Ian Brown here at the University of Alabama did a good bit of excavation out there. And has several articles and books that are out if folks are interested in finding those. He and a gentleman that we just lost recently named Rick Fuller did a really interesting book that talks about Bottle Creek, and I recommend that folks get a hold of that if they're interested in Bottle Creek and reading more about it. But it's an amazing site. It has 18 mounds. There are specific locations that we think are likely craft production locations. I think Mark talked a little bit last week about the lapidary industry, bead production. They were making shell beads out at this site. And we know that from the number of microliths concentrated on the site. Microliths are tiny. They're just like what they sound like, tiny pieces of rock that were broken to form very small blades. And they probably would have been hafted on the end of a stick, or if they were large enough to be held in the hand, and they were used to carve shell to make not just beads, but also pendants and what are referred to as gorgets and other things that are absolutely incredible. So, anybody got any questions on Bottle Creek?
Let me see. Let me pull the presentation off. So let's see. Looks like we've got a comment from Mark saying, always enjoyed working with the folks in Alabama to identify significant prehistoric sites and list them on the National Register and or National Historic Landmarks. I guess that leads into a good question from Mark's comment here. Can you tell us about the National Registry or the National Historic Landmarks and how that factors into these sites?
Okay. So Bottle Creek is on the National Register. It is an absolutely incredible archaeological site. And there are a number of sites that are on the National Register in Alabama. And there's a whole process that goes into that. So the National Register of Historic Places was designed to help to protect and bring to light a lot of these locations. Moundville is on the National Register. It's also a National Historic Landmark, and National Register, being on the National Register and being a National Historic Landmark are sort of like two different levels. To get to be identified as a National Historic Landmark, it has to be applied for and granted by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Landmarks are administered by the National Park Service. They are, again, designed to kind of help to bring recognition to these properties and show the country where they are and to document them more thoroughly than they might be otherwise. Now, we often get questions associated with cultural resource management projects where people are hesitant to have things listed on the National Register because they're afraid that it's going to restrict their ability to develop a property. So say you have a historic building in your community that was, and it's likely that the site is eligible for listing to the National Register of Historic Places. People get concerned that if it's on the register, they won't be able to paint it a different color, or they won't be able to do renovations to it to bring it up to modern standards. But that's not the case. If a property is owned by the federal government or a property is owned by the state, there are more restrictions on it. But if it's privately owned, those owners have to take the responsibility onto themselves as to whether or not they want to protect it. It doesn't restrict people from doing what they want to private property. So it's kind of something that a lot of people get nervous about, but really it's a fantastic thing for our people to be able to recognize these properties and to understand their heritage. So Mark, that's a great question. I really appreciate you sending that in. Again, if you have any questions about the National Register or National Historic Landmarks, the Park Service has a fantastic webpage that actually has a database that lists all of the National Historic landmarks and all the properties that are on the National Register. And then Alabama also has its own register. And that register, some of those coincide with properties that are on the National Register, and some of them don't. Some of them are things that are considered significant only to the state of Alabama. So folks should definitely check out the Alabama Historical Commission's webpage, as well as the National Park Services.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, I can pull that up a little bit later on. And I think I found Ian's books, maybe, just to see if these are the correct books. Is it Bottle Creek, a Pensacola culture site in South Alabama? I think that's one of them. And I think there's also one called Bottle Creek Reflections.
That's a really interesting one because it's Ian Brown's kind of personal notes about what he was doing out there, and his the anecdotal stories about the field work that they were going through. And if you want to talk about an amazing archaeological project, trying to facilitate a field school in the middle of a swamp in the summertime in Alabama is no easy task. And there's always stories and crazy situations that arise. And that book is neat because it talks about a lot of those interesting events that they experienced, and has a lot of funny stories in it that people will really appreciate. And it gives you a better understanding of what it's like to be an archaeologist. It's not all, it's certainly not Indiana Jones, I can tell you that much. But there are times where being an archaeologist is amazing and incredible, and the exploration is so much fun. And there are times when it is difficult and mundane and boring as all get out. So I guess that's kind of the way it is with everybody's job.
Yeah, that sounds just like most jobs, but archaeology has the advantage of getting to explore history and culture. So that's really cool. Well, we'll include links to Ian books in the description of this video after we end the live stream. So make those available to everybody if you're interested in those books by Ian. All right, should we hop back on the trail?
Yep, we need to get back on the trail. I'm not sure we're going to make it through all of our sites today, and that's perfectly fine. We can have a third installment if we have to.
Okay.
Excuse me. But we're going to bounce all the way up to the northeast portion of the state now. We're going to go to Choccolocco Creek Archaeological Complex. And this is a really unique addition to the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail. The mounds that were associated with this are primarily gone. They've either been plowed down or removed or heavily modified. But the really interesting thing is the city of Oxford has developed a park and rebuilt a lot of these. So now there are multiple mounds. Some are stone, some are earthen, that are at their athletic complex that they built south of Highway 2059. And they've done a really good job of creating a park that shows and really highlights the cultural heritage of that area, and incorporated it into the athletic complex, which has baseball and soccer and softball tournaments, and it's really an amazing facility. So it's an incredible place to go visit, even if you're not going to a baseball or softball tournament. It's a great place to go visit and look around, but it also ties in several of the features that still remain intact that are in the surrounding landscape, including some effigy mounds that are up on the mountains around the area, up in the Piedmont of Alabama. And some of these sites are really worth taking an opportunity to go take a look at. This one was kind of unusual in the sense that we've got a couple sites where the mounds have either been excavated or removed, but we don't have one that had so much work done so recently on it and had such a really neat ethno-historic aspect to it. And Robert Perry is the archaeologist that's been working on this site for a number of years, and he has done a fantastic job of working with the Muscogee Creek Nation, in particular, the Abika, who considered this to be their traditional homelands, and this was actually part of their ceremonial grounds. And through going through all the background research, looking at the material maintained at the Smithsonian, going through the excavations at a site called the Davis Farm and the adjacent areas, and then talking with many of the elders in the Abika, he ended up coming up with an absolutely amazing story that tells the whole history of this site and this complex and how it came to be, and was able to bring back a number of the folks who were descendants of the Abika who called this their home. But Robert's working on the report for this project right now. I think he's published a couple of articles at this point that are really neat, and they talk about some of the research that he's done. But he's been able to define a couple of different ceramic complexes that had previously been undefined. He's been able to show the relationship of these people to other locations. And he's done a great job of tying in the stories that a lot of the elders of the Muscogee Creek Nation maintained in their oral traditions, and was able to tie a lot of those to how this site came about and what it all was. So we know that this was one of the tribal towns that later became part of the Muscogee Creek Nation. The Abika have been in this area for centuries, millennia. They've done a lot of their own research into their oral traditions and where they came from. But then we also have the information at the Smithsonian that Robert was able to tie together. And what he has found is that this was a community that was probably started, at least in the woodland, circa 100 BC. These people had a vibrant culture that lived in this valley. They were spread all over the region. They had ties to probably the Etowah site up in northwestern Georgia. They had relationships with cultures up in that area, as opposed to having stronger relationships with the folks that settled Moundville. So these people came along relatively early on. They started building mounds in the area during the woodlands. They progressed into the Mississippian. But at one point, they had a community that was built around a spring. And at some point, there was a cataclysmic event that resulted in a massive flood and the creation of a large sinkhole. A big portion of the karst topography in that area collapsed.
Mm.
And so karst topography refers to limestone that has a tendency to create voids in it. And when I say voids, I mean caves, underground openings that gradually weaken over time as the waters tend to erode the limestone. And what happens is you end up with collapses or sinkholes, which many people are familiar with that live in Alabama, particularly the northern part of the state. If you live up in the Tennessee Valley, for instance, you know that there are sinkholes everywhere, sinkholes and caves everywhere. Well, that's also the case in this portion of the Piedmont. We know that there was a collapse that occurred, and this town supposedly drowned and was consumed by the flood and the collapse of the karst topography. So we know that there was a stone mound up on top of one of the hills near this site. And the stone mound, we believe, was constructed by burden stones. And burden stones would have been stones that the people who had relations that were lost in this massive flood event were carrying the stones up to the summit in remembrance of their family members. We know that some of those stones are relatively large, and anybody that would have carried it up the side of the hill would have been struggling like crazy. And we know that a lot of these are relatively small and lightweight. but it looks like all of these stones were carried up the side of that mountain to remember the family members and the ancestors who died as a result of that flood. And the Abika maintains some of these traditions today, and they still tell the story of some of these things and these events. They talk about um, certain spiritual creatures that were tied to this event and how they relate to what happened and the loss of a lot of their family members. So it's really an amazing story. Robert's done a great job of working with all these different groups to bring this information together. The tribal representatives that have been involved with this, both just from the Abika and from the entire Muscogee Creek Nation, have been really great in providing historic, oral traditions and sharing that information with the archaeologists so we can get a better understanding of what this complex was all about. But we know that the Chocolaco Valley has a very, very, very rich archaeological tradition. And we know that occupation in that area goes back to the Paleo Indian. There are a number of Paleo Indian sites recorded in that area. But by the Mississippi, and this area was densely occupied by the folks who became known as the Creeks. And that tradition continued right up on through European contact. And the Coosa Valley was one of the most densely occupied parts of Alabama in the early historic period. And there's all types of stories of the traders that were trading deer hides with the Creeks in this area. And if anybody looks up the reason that all of these different towns and groups that became known as the Muscogee Creek Nation, how they became known as the Creeks, you'll find that the primary reason is because these folks tended to live along creeks and rivers in that area. And Europeans referred to them as a whole as the Creeks. So kind of an interesting way that they got their name. Muscogee is the traditional name that they identify themselves as, but they were a culture that had an incredible amount of variety within it. We know that the Seminole Nation has a lot of Creek members in it. We know that they controlled an area that included all the way to the Atlantic coast, up to up into the Tennessee Valley, further upriver. We know that the area up around Gunnersville had Creek occupation at one time. We know that they went all the way over into West Alabama. In fact, we know that here near Moundville, we had Creek traders in this area in the 1700s. We know that from a site just upriver here from Moundville, where we have traditional Creek ceramics, and we also have some glass trade beads that came from that site. Now, those materials come from an area that had always sort of been considered a no man's land or a common hunting ground that sort of formed the boundaries between the groups that we recognize as the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee. But within those different groups, there are all types of tribal towns that are sort of lumped together as one of those four groups. So get back over to East Alabama. The Chocolaco Creek area had, like I mentioned earlier, direct ties to Northwest Georgia and the cultures that arose to form Etowah. And the Etowah culture in Northwest Georgia was sort of, I don't know as they were in competition with Moundville, but they definitely had interactions with the folks from Moundville. We know that we've got some trade goods that appear at Etowah. And we know that Etowah was occupied very late into prehistory and likely heavily occupied into the historic period. So I'm sorry, Rebecca, you sound like you were about to ask me a question.
Oh, no, it's fine. Well, I was curious about the Chocoloco Creek site because of the flood stories. So, do we have archaeological evidence that speaks to anything that you might have found during? You talked about the burden stones. So, are those things? Do we actually have? Any of those stones that we can point to that these were actually what the stones would have looked like?
We know that we have documentation of the stones. We know that we have documentation of the mound site. If you go back into the what late 2000s, there's a number of stories that talk about the documentation of that site, and there was some controversy involved with it. But Robert has been working on the actual site of the drowned town and found some really incredible information that, yes, through the geoarchaeological analysis, they have clearly demonstrated that there had been a town there and it was consumed by a flood. So it's pretty amazing to see the story and how the archaeology and the geoarchaeology and the oral traditions and the material culture all come together to indicate that, yes, indeed, there was this major event that occurred that wiped out a town, that altered a culture dramatically, that resulted in them having whole new traditions and ideas that, we didn't know about until recently. And there are stories like that from all over our country, let alone just here in Alabama. And again, one of the reasons that we tell people to really start visiting these tribal nations web pages and start talking with the folks that are the Aboriginal folks from these regions is to get a better understanding of what these sites are like and what those cultures have to offer and the stories that they can tell us about what's here.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that all of those aspects that you do in terms of the research and finding all that information gives you a bigger, broader picture of what might have happened there. It's really
Well, in
cool.
our first live stream, we talked about archaeology and how it isn't just the pretty rocks that you find. It's so much more. It's the stories that come out of it, and it really helps to give us a better understanding of who we are and where we come from, and the incredible cultural heritage that our state alone has to offer. It's amazing, and it can only benefit us if we learn more about who these people are and who their ancestors were and who we are. So
Yeah,
it's great
absolutely.
opportunity.
Yeah, I
All
think
right.
it impacts everybody in the area.
Yeah, take advantage, by all means, take advantage of these things. Go to the Alabama Department of Archives and History and look at their museum. Go talk with the folks at the Alabama Historical Commission. Talk with the tribes that are both here in Alabama and that have been removed to Oklahoma. And all of these places have web pages with a lot of information. Right now, under our restrictive travel bans, it's difficult to get down to Archives and History and walk through their amazing museum, or come here to Moundville and walk through our amazing museum. But you still have opportunities to get online and look at the things that they have to offer. So by all means, do it. All right. So we're moving up the Coosa River Valley. So Chocoloco Creek feeds into the Coosa River, and now we're heading upstream on the Coosa River towards the Georgia border, and we're going to talk about a site called the Coker Ford site. And Coker Ford was a really interesting site up on the Chattooga River. So where the Coosa River cuts north, there are two rivers that feed into it just outside of Cedar Bluff, Alabama. And those are the Little River and the Chattooga River. And where they come together was an incredibly important location, both prehistorically and early in the history of our region. Alabama obviously has some absolutely incredible river systems, but this river, the Coosa River, tying into all of these smaller feeder streams, that came in. I say smaller feeder streams. If anybody has seen Little River Canyon, when the water's gushing through there, it's not a little river. It's a pretty incredible thing. I was talking with a gentleman yesterday who said that they had gone hiking in Little River Canyon a couple years back, and the river was dry, and they were actually hiking in the riverbed. And then a couple months later, we had one of the wettest winters in Alabama history, and Little River had the highest water levels ever recorded. And he said it was just absolutely amazing. And if you think of those rivers and where they come out and dump into the Coosa River, that's the location that we're talking about. So the Coker Ford site was occupied primarily during the late woodland. And this site was excavated by the University of Alabama back in the 60s. And the guy that did the work on this, Benny Keel, went on to become the head archaeologist for the National Park Service. And Benny is a really interesting guy. He has some fantastic stories about working in this area. But what he found in this region were a series of palisaded villages that are really interesting, because this comes at a time during the late woodlands where we know things are starting to transition, where we have folks coming into western Alabama that are pretty aggressive. They're taking over new locations and they're exploring new territories, and sometimes they're assimilating with the folks in those territories, and sometimes they're conquering the folks in those territories. And for the number of sites that we have concentrated in and around the Coker Ford site that have these palisaded complexes, some of them have the moats that we talked about a couple weeks ago. These were clearly defensive positions, and they were protecting themselves from folks that were coming into their region and invading. And whether they represent the populations that had moved in and taken over territory and were building these protective forts, much like you would consider the U.S. Army in the 1800s when they were forcing their way into new territories in the West and building a series of forts to help protect themselves against the indigenous populations that were in those regions, or if these were folks that lived in that region and were protecting themselves against invaders. We're not sure. We think most likely these were the indigenous folks that lived in that area, and they were protecting themselves against folks that were interloping, because we know that the pottery traditions that we're seeing have a lot of time depth in that region. That means they've been around for quite a while. But the Coker Ford site was really neat. It had two mounds on it, both of which were kind of unusual for that region. They were earthen mounds that were covered with stone. Now, we see a lot of earthen mounds throughout Alabama, as we've been talking about, but to have them specifically set up to where they had an earthen core and then were covered by stones is sort of unusual. But it was not just those two those two mounds that were covered with stones. It's also the incredible village site that was situated adjacent to these mounds. And again, when we talk about these areas, we're talking about a point that would have been vital for trade in that area. Again, you've got these two river systems coming together right here, and then joining the Coosa River. So basically three rivers coming together. And this would have been one of the areas that would have provided for folks to travel from the Coosa Valley up over the mountain and get into the Tennessee Valley. Plus, they would have been able to continue up the Coosa River Valley all the way, like we said, up to Etowah, and tie into the cultures of northwestern Georgia, what's become northwestern Georgia. We know that along the Chattooga River, there are some incredible lithic resources. There's some Conestoga chert that comes out in that area that's really beautiful. It comes in a really neat little nodular form, very unique, very distinct to the geologic formation. And we know that folks were taking complete advantage of that in the region, probably one of the prime items to be traded. But we also know that this area is very interesting historically. Now, Keith Little did his dissertation research on sites up in this region, and Keith did some really neat work looking at the later occupation. So after Coker Ford had been abandoned, and other sites had been developed in this area, Keith thinks that what we're seeing are later developments of cultures that were sort of forced out of other places. So in our first round, we talked about the diseases that helped to wipe out 75 to 90% of the population of the indigenous folks in this region. And we talked about how there were cities that were documented by DeSoto's expedition in an area that we think is somewhere around Etowah, down into this portion of the Coosa River Valley. And it talked about the structures that were massive, that you could fit 1,000 people into, and buildings that had ornate carvings and statuaries out front with images of warriors that were, over 12 feet tall, and the buildings themselves on the interior were strung with pearls, and they had elaborate carved wooden boxes in them that held the remains of the ancestors. And we know that it's possible that the city of Coosa that is described by DeSoto it's possible that it's Etowah, the Etowah Mound site itself, or an area or a site somewhere up in that area. Keith thinks that that's the case, that Etowah was the location of Coosa. And during his research, he found that that occupation seems to have dissipated after the diseases were introduced to the region, likely as a result of the DeSoto expedition. And we know that when Pardo and DeLuna had their expeditions years later, that one of the folks that had been with DeSoto was traveling with them and came to what he remembered as being the location of Coosa, and said that he must have been bewitched because the place that they were visiting in the later expedition was nowhere near as grandiose as the Coosa he remembered. There weren't hundreds of buildings there like there had been the first time. There were a few dozen. The architecture was nowhere near as amazing. It was much smaller. The people seemed like they were nowhere near as proud and distinct as they had been when the DeSoto expedition went through. And Dr. Little thinks that that's likely the result of those populations having to vacate their original site of Coosa up on the Coosa River further upstream, and moving downstream and building new towns in cities or communities with a population that had been devastated by these diseases that swept through. So, whether or not that's true remains to be seen. We still have a lot of research to do before we're going to be able to have a better understanding of this. But most likely, Coker Ford represents the ancestors of the people that developed Coosa and became described in the DeSoto Chronicles as such an amazing culture. But we know that this site at Coker Ford right now, it's inaccessible. It's actually inundated in Weiss Reservoir. But the sign that we're going to have is situated at one of the historic iron furnaces that's right nearby, and folks can go visit that and read about Coker Ford site and get a better understanding of what was there. In the wintertime, when the water comes down, you can see two stone piles that are out in the reservoir as they get exposed with the water level down. But those are actually piles of stones that were removed during the excavations, the archaeological excavations, and then just stacked out of the way. And that area is protected. It's on private property. Alabama Power Company ensures that those areas are preserved, and they do a great job of helping to protect the sites on their property. So, Rebecca, are you still there?
Yeah, yeah, I'm still here. I just went full screen so that we could see that a little better. Um, I'm starting to realize as we go through these sites that I need to do more research into DeSoto. I didn't realize until we started going through the trail that some of the information that he would have gathered would be very important to all of these sites and how we know about them. So I think I think I'm gonna have to do some personal research into that aspect of it to try to pair what we're talking about here with all of that. That's really interesting.
Absolutely, and we know so little about DeSoto. Back in the 30s, the DeSoto Commission was put together with the intent of tracing the route that DeSoto made. And there was some fantastic work done by John Swanton. But the findings that he had are pretty limited. There are no sites that indicate where Coosa was. There are no sites that indicate where Mauvilla was. You know, two major events that occurred during DeSoto's expedition through the South. We know that Pinson Mounds out in Arkansas is the site where he spent a period of time and had an incredible event happen. And if you've never had a chance to go out to Pinson Mounds in Arkansas, it's an amazing place. But supposedly that was the location where they met a friendly group. They set up for quite a while, and supposedly there was a major drought occurring. And the community came to DeSoto and said that they had been, when DeSoto traveled, he traveled, we think about all the conquistadors and the soldiers that went with him, but he traveled with a massive entourage that included everything from washerwomen to Franciscan monks. And they had been proselytizing to the natives in that area. They had been trying to seek converts. And the leaders came to DeSoto one day and said, if your God is so wonderful, why don't you have him make it rain? So DeSoto came up with a plan. They built supposedly 100-foot tall cross that was mounted on top of one of the mounds. And they had a big ceremony, and they prayed to God for rain. And supposedly it resulted in a rain event that lasted for 40 days.
Wow.
Sound familiar?
Yes, yes.
So they had this big rain event. It ended up being, the savior of the community and everything. But Pinson Mounds in recent years has done some remote sensing and some excavation, and they actually think that they may have part of the feature associated with the construction of that 100-foot tall cross. And it would be absolutely amazing if they can tie together those two stories.
Wow.
So it's a pretty neat story. But shortly after that, DeSoto he dies out in Arkansas, somewhere in Arkansas, and his troops cast him into the Mississippi River, tied up and clothed and bound down with stones so that he sinks to the bottom of the river because they're afraid that he's angered so many of the local tribes in that area that they would get a hold of him and desecrate his body, which they very likely would have done for the things that he did while he was traveling through the area. But again, the DeSoto Chronicles are a really interesting read. If you haven't had a chance to get a hold of that, it's an amazing 2-volume set published by the University of Alabama Press. Great read, and it provides a lot of insight into the folks that were here when Europeans arrived. And you can't help but recognize the absolutely horrifying bias that's presented by the author and considered by the Spaniards that are traveling through the area how they treat the natives, how they take advantage of the natives, how they absolutely decimate the native populations. But it's a very interesting document to have an opportunity to read and research. So.
Yeah, the only DeSoto information I really know is about the DeSoto Caverns. I think we took a field trip out there one time when I was in school, so I need to do much more research now that I'm older and have more of a concept of what that history was. So that's definitely a good recommendation. I'll try. I'll try to look into that before our next hop on the Mound Trail.
Absolutely incredible place to visit. Awesome state park. Beautiful cavern, but has absolutely nothing to do with DeSoto.
Yes. Okay. That's good to know. So we have about 5 minutes left. People have been enjoying your talk. Ben says it's great to hear Matt talking about this history, and Nancy says she's been enjoying your presentations. So I think this has been another successful trip around the Mound Trail. Matt, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave with people about the sites that we talked about today?
All right. We still have a few more sites to go through, so I guess we'll have to have another session of this, at least one more. That should get us through all of them. But I just want to remind people, by all means, go out. When the time comes that you can go visit these sites, by all means, do it. They're absolutely amazing locations. You'll learn so much from them. They're beautiful places to visit, but in every sense of the word, help us to preserve them. Be careful what you do while you're out there. Don't go stomping on top of the mounds and damaging them. We've had to deal with that here at Moundville in the past, where people want the opportunity to get up on top of these mounds and see what the indigenous populations would have seen, to have an opportunity to kind of interact with the history of the place and the heritage of the place. But it ends up causing problems, and you've got to be respectful of these sites. You've got to help us to preserve them. Bottle Creek, for instance, if you have an opportunity to go out there, by all means do, but make sure you go with a guide, somebody that can show you the easiest way to get out there, because I can tell you from personal experience, it's incredibly easy to get lost out there. And those guides will also help to make sure that your visit is a constructive one, where it doesn't result in damage to the mounds or the features that are there. It's so difficult to recognize a lot of the things that are really sensitive at these archaeological sites. So many of them are just below the ground surface. By all means, respect them, protect them, help us to save them. And by all means, don't just go digging on them. We have had folks come out here to the park at Moundville and think that it's an awesome opportunity to bring their kids and go dig like you would in a sandbox, but that's not the case. Every time that the ground is broken around here, it ends up damaging some part of our heritage. And if we're going to damage it, archaeology in all its wonderful forms still destroys archaeological sites. The difference is it's done in a way that helps us to gather the data and learn from it. So by all means, help us to preserve our heritage, protect these sites, but get out and take a look at them, learn about them. And while you're trapped at home during this COVID-19 thing, visit our webpage. Take advantage of all the resources that are available out there, because there are a lot of them. All of the universities in the Southeast that have anthropology programs typically have a really good webpage that talks about the projects they're working on or have worked on in the past, and will give you an opportunity to learn a lot about archaeology, both here in our state and in the surrounding area.
Yeah, and you can go and visit the Alabama Indigenous Mound Trail by going to alabamamoundtrail.org, and you can find information that way. This has been a great time with you, Matt, this morning to talk about these sites and to learn about them. And so thank you for coming on to share that information with us. I think that's going to do it for this Museums from Your Home live stream. We're running out of time here. But we will be doing this every weekday, Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. And each day will feature a different aspect of UA museums. Every Wednesday it's archaeology. So if you like Matt and what Mark have shared with us so far, come back on Wednesdays and check out the Archaeology Day. So tomorrow, though, we'll be talking about natural history. So make sure to come back to UA Museums for the Alabama Museum of Natural History. More specifically, their Facebook page will also be on the UA Museum's YouTube channel tomorrow at 10 a.m. to talk about natural history. And for a full live stream schedule, if you're curious about everything that we do every day and links to our UA Museum's Color Art Collections coloring book and links to our educational sources from Discovering Alabama, the Alabama Museum of Natural History, and Mount Archaeological Park. If you're interested in any of those educational things, if you've got kids at home who are now doing all their schoolwork from home and you want to have some additional educational resources, we have all of those at museums.ua.edu/museums from your home. That will sort of act as a one-stop shop for you if you're curious about any of the live streams that we have and the video that we've done and the educational resources that we have. So I guess that's going to do it for what we're doing here. But thanks for spending some time with us this morning. And thank you for visiting UA Museums from your home. Hope everybody has a great day.